Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Lost Origin, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our top 10 decks for Lost Origin. We actually have 5 regional events in this Lost Origin format. There are 2 in Europe and 3 over in the US, starting as of next week in Peoria. So we thought it was a good time to start looking at these decks and start to get a rank going of them. This is mostly based on our own testing, as well as the recent online data. So there's still a lot that can change about the format, and I'm sure we may not be spot on for everything, but these are our most up-to-date lists, importantly. We're also going to talk about tech cards and where we feel the meta's shaping up right now.
Yeah, so just a bit of background on sort of where we're getting where we're starting our information from. There's been 2 tournaments, one in Singapore and one in Japan, that have already used the new Lost Origin cards. So we've had some real life data as well as some online tournaments. On the far left, you've got the results of the top 16 of the nearly 3,200 player Champions League in Yokohama, which is pretty crazy. That's a lot of players. These Japanese tournaments typically get a lot of players, but that was absolutely huge. So that was great to see. And you can see the breakdown of the top 16 there. Lots of the Lost Zone engine, as you can tell. In the middle, Singapore, the graphic from our friends at TCG they've laid out the top 8, which again, I think it was around 120 players that went into a top 8 bracket, and you can see that Mew is the most popular deck there, but still plenty of Giratina and Kyurem and stuff like that. And then finally, as I mentioned, the online results. These are the most frequent or most played decks over the past, or basically since Lost Origin has been released on the Play Limiters platform. So we can kind of also gauge popularity. Typically, a lot of these archetypes are more popular in the first few weeks. So things like maybe Mew and Palkia, even though they are still very high, will perhaps overtake them. But for now, we can still see that a lot of these decks are being tried out, and rest assured, even though the results aren't on the screen, there are plenty of good results in online tournaments from these new archetypes as well.
Let's start off with number 10 then. We have Hisui and Goodra. I also did put a poll out on Twitter, so we will be getting some community ratings as well, more or less in line here, where they had it as the 11th best deck, and of course I'm grouping some archetypes as well. So there is some decent rating of Hisui and Goodra, and it's had a few okay online results as well. I feel like it's got good tanking potential, as we know from this rolling iron effect, giving yourself an 80 reduction, which is very strong. I do think there's a ton of escape rope in the format anyway at the moment, because it just seems very valuable with Comfey and wanting to move other things out the active position, mostly Empoleon Vs. So I do think that there are many decks that have Boss's Orders potential alongside a Rope or alongside cross switchers. So there are ways of getting around this rolling iron, but you force combinations from certain decks, which is always nice. And I still enjoy the way I've been playing the deck basically all along, which is like the sort of tempo style, where you just try and represent that turn 2 Goodra, oftentimes alongside Melanie if you haven't been able to get to Mirage Gate just yet. But either way, it means you have a very consistent way of starting to use Rolling Iron quickly, and you can make a very awkward prize race most of the time by forcing your opponent through a couple of V-Stars, and also if they are sort of taking one prize knockouts on Comphase and whatnot, you can then start using other one prizes like Radiant Greninja and Cramorant to force them back onto an odd prize map. So you can try and make things a little bit awkward for them. Obviously, you can net up certain parts of your board. You don't need to go crazy with your Lost Zone engine because A, you have backup draw from Melanie, and B, you only need to get to 7 for Mirage Gate, so you don't need to go wild and have Comphase on board every single turn of the game. It just sort of starts on the field, and then you end up with 1 or 2 Goodras, and that's basically it. So it can be really annoying still in the game. And the list is actually unchanged from the list that was on the channel because A, it's been the most successful online right now with essentially no changes, and B, it still fits my theory of what's the best way to play the deck. So there are a few things that I would possibly add in, but at the moment I'm still really happy with where my initial 60s got in the online field. But there are more defensive plays you can obviously go for. I still am a big fan of the choice belts, of course, but Big Charm and Fantina can give you more defensive plays, not just the Rolling Iron, of course. So you can try and buff yourself up that little bit more. You can also add in some hand disruption, because as we've seen from the Lost Zone engines at this point, they're constantly getting like +1s and +2s from their Choruses, their Greninja, their Comphase, that sort of thing, that they end up accumulating like 13, 14, 15 card hand sizes. So having Roxanne in here as a disruptor and leaving them with a low hand size and just 1 or 2 Comphase to sort of get combinations, it can be a great option to have in the list. And also Zamazenta V, mostly for a late game sort of beat stick, giving you potentially more damage output than the Rolling Iron naturally has, but also giving yourself type coverage into Kiram VMAX, which can be one of the more difficult archetypes for this deck to take on, especially for the build that I've just shown without many defensive options. So having an aggressive approach where you can attach Mirage Gate to a Zamazenta, you're obviously already playing Metal Energy. You can have an easy way of having this late game higher burst potential, especially into what is otherwise one of your more awkward matchups. So still really like Goodra. I think there are a few tweaks you can still make to the list that I initially made, but I'm actually not that far off, I think, from having already a competitive 60, which is cool to see.
So we have Hisuian Zoroark, another of the V-Star Pokemon from Lost Origin. Hisuian Zoroark is a really, really good sort of tempo deck. It's great against taking out multi-prize Pokemon. It does really well into trading into them. Some of the issues can sort of arise when you're playing against some of these purely one-prize decks, but against all of the Vs and V-Stars out there, because you're able to draw additional cards with Phantom Star, it's actually a really good turn 2 bossing deck, to be honest. It's something that is very, very consistent in doing that, as long as you sort of build the list around it. And it actually isn't as difficult, or isn't as I guess it isn't as difficult as it may seem to get into those really big numbers, which is really cool to see. It's a really interesting sort of, like I say, it doesn't have too many frills, or it doesn't have huge ways of like changing matchups too much. It's very, very linear, but it's just really good at being aggressive. And taking a look at the list, there's a couple of ways you can kind of build around it. The list we've got here is a purely double turbo based engine. I think that's definitely there's definitely an argument to just playing the double turbo based engine. It's a bit annoying because the double turbo does hurt your damage a little bit, especially against V maxes. You have to Kyurem in particular, you really struggle to reach on, hence the inclusion of the Radiant Hawlucha. But overall, it opens up a bit more space compared to some other builds that we'll talk about momentarily. The Diancie is another really nice option that I think is fantastic for the early turns of this game. If you're going second, you're able to use Zoroark's first attack to basically hit and run into the Diancie, protecting your Zoroarks to be able to then evolve them up and start taking KOs from turn 2, but that little extra bit of chip damage as well, not particularly in this build, but in other builds, is actually really useful. In this build, we've also got the Barrel line. I think the Barrel is also really nice for basically the idea of the deck, or what the deck loves to do, is just draw as many cards in the early turns, research and Phantom Star to dig as fast as you can towards boss's orders, and then really try and just triple boss throughout the game. It's a really, really nice tempo deck. Again, not huge amounts of outplay potential with this build, but in general, a really, really aggressive deck, to be honest. The build that we actually slightly prefer, going on to the potential includes, though, is actually a water-based build, and you do have to adapt the deck quite differently. You have to include some Melanies, you have to kind of switch up the support account, but it opens up being able to play Empoleon and Radiant Greninja, two cards that are obviously absolutely brilliant right now. Greninja just helps, again, with basically looking for that boss game plan that the deck really looks to do. It helps. It's an additional amount of draw, as well as sort of setting up the melodies and stuff in the late game for when they are inevitably feeding you 2 prizes, which is nice. And Empoleon is obviously kind of the hot card right now, really. It's fantastic at trying to disrupt the Lost Zone engine in the early turns, which obviously I just mentioned is a bit of an issue for the deck, because the deck typically wants to be dealing with 2 prizes most of the time. Empoleon gives you a little bit of respite against that, being able to trade against them, as well as trying to sort of disrupt them. You can also pretty easily, with things like Capture Energy and stuff, hit and run into the Empoleon on turn 1 if you're going second, which is really nice because it means that you don't have to worry about finding switch outs or anything, and you're automatically just trying to slow them down, which is what you need in the matchup, to be honest. You can also add things like Dunsparce and Manaphy, very, very respectable cards. Again, we still will be rating Arceus, you'll see momentarily, and it's going to be important to not have some of these fighting techs that people are trying to weave in punish you too much. As well as Manaphy, I mean, we can see when we get to some Lost Zone lists, you can see that Radiant Greninja is still very much a big part of the game, and having even more one prize Pokemon like Comfey and stuff coming into the format and being so important is just sort of increasing Radiant Greninja's usage so much more. So this can help in terms of stopping your opponent taking 2 prizes with a 1 prizer in other matchups as well, which is really nice. I think the list is a bit tighter when it comes to the water build, and it does. You do have to start looking at some more awkward cuts to be able to fit some of the water package in, but I think overall, in my opinion, it's probably worth it because just the being able to get use out of Greninja plus Empoleon, they're 2 fantastic cards right now, and they really, really do help sort of the deck flow in and the deck do what it needs to do in finding boss as much as possible while still helping you out against some of these 1 prize matchups. So yeah, really fairly linear deck. I think the water build opens up some doors, but a really, really nice aggressive deck for dealing with 2 prize Pokemon.
On to number 8 then, we have the Regigigas. It still seems to be one of the most impressive single prize decks, and it has gained gift energy, which is a really nice inclusion, so that you have inbuilt protection from hand disruption. Previously it was just the Regidrago, but now you have this little extra bit of help, which is nice. There is the looming fear of Lost City though, and that is a challenge certainly for the deck. So having answers and constant stadium bounces is going to be important. And also there is the fear that we've just talked about, Empoleon V finding its way into potentially a number of decks. So I think Path of the Peak is probably the best way to be playing the Regis right now, just out of safety. It means that you can slow down Mew at random stages in the game, have a good amount of outs to Lost City, and it means you're not immediately scooping to Duraludon or Empoleon V. So as we get to the list, you can see that I've got a couple of ropes as well as 3 paths in here, so that should be a decent amount of bounce and defense against Empoleon and other stuff like that. And I'm actually playing 3 Gigas now, as well as 3 Regieleki. So the reason why I like 3 Gigas specifically is because Gigas is going to be in the line of fire when you're up against Mew, right? Because he's your best attacker, because this is how you can one-hit KO VMAXs. So it's typically one of the go-to threats that Mew will try and target, and it's also typically not been a card that we've had 3 copies of often. So in a closed deck field, like in person tournaments, they may not be expecting a 3rd copy of the Gigas. They may feel like they've already wrapped out the game with a Lost City play and a knockout on Gigas, and then you bench the 3rd one and just one-shot them with a choice belt and bring all your stuff back. So I think the Gigas at 3 makes a little bit of sense for me right now. I also like the 3 copies of Aleki, also again giving you some protection against the Lost City, because again Aleki is one of your more favoured attackers, but also having 130 hit points on this other lightning type Regieleki, it makes it more awkward for Sableye to have a constant one-hit KO option from just sprinkling 12 counters. So having this extra 10 hit points is actually annoying for some Lost Zone box decks, which is basically just trying to hard race you and oftentimes needs the Sableye to have the option to target your one Aleki over and over again. So having that denial can be really annoying for certain builds of the Cram, especially ones that aren't playing Articuno, of course, so that's really cool. The ropes also help out against Flying Pikachu, which is less prevalent but still a card in the game. And yeah, outside of that, it's just a fairly heavy path build. I have been playing around with counts a lot with this deck. I think the Trekking Shoes are kind of flexible cards if you want that second twin to help out against Mew, that second gift energy, just more captures are always good. Even just having the additional nets to help out against the Lost box. I've thought about all these cards, to be honest, but also a few other potential includes. We've seen Pokegear in the past to maybe cherry pick some supporters, and maybe then you can start thinking of having like lower counts of the Marnies and throw in other things like Cynthia's Ambition. I think Ambition gets a little bit less value in general because you already have gift energy, so Cynthia's just kind of like less proactive than having Marnie in the first place, plus Marnie has the added upside of being good alongside Path just as a cheese factor. Then there's the Thornton plays. I've been pretty anti-Thornton with the deck, but Yveltal does give you a way at least around Duraludon, which lets you play Pokestop potentially. If you just expect 1 counts of Empoleon, you could go to a higher rope count and have Thornton as your Duraludon answer, whilst also being just like a great one-hit kill option against other tanky stuff. So that could be kind of okay. I still think Thornton's gimmicky, but some people are still enjoying it. I think most recent online results are showing that it's best without Thornton right now, but it is what it is. And then finally, Pokestop. We know it's like a better stadium in Regis, but I feel like you're just sacrificing a lot by removing Path. I think Empoleon's a real threat, and I think Duraludon is still a deck in the game where we already have like optimal 60s galore, and it's just like an easy choice in most tournaments. And I also think with the uptick in like one prize lost boxes, it makes sense to play a deck like Arc Duraludon right now that just has higher hit points, is an annoying Pokemon to get through, and has healing. So I think from a metagame perspective, I also prefer Paths right now in my Reggie deck.
Speaking of Arc Duraludon, that is our number 7th pick. It feels like a deck that actually a lot of the community, and you can see that from the 16th place, have kind of forgotten about, kind of been playing around with some of the new stuff. But we still think it's a really solid deck, to be honest. There's a lot of one prize matchups that really struggle dealing with a couple of Duraludons. There's a lot of special energy starting to creep back into the format. There's a lot of things to keep in mind, which is really cool to see. I think there's not a huge amount of changes going into the list overall, but it's just this notion of trying to create a lot of big Pokemon that your opponent will really struggle to deal with, and before you just inevitably pulverize through everything, which is really cool. I think there was a lot of people thought that sort of Goodra was going to be the new Duraludon, but I think there's still definitely merits to this deck. I think it's there's a little bit less sort of worry with all of the ropes and stuff. Goodra actually isn't as tanky as it initially people may have thought. Whereas Duraludon, just because it has that raw HP, is still a real sticking point, and it's really difficult to deal with. So yeah, it's definitely still something to keep in mind in the meta. The list that we're taking a look at is actually basically Stefan Ivanov's from last weekend in Bilbao, which finished in 2nd place. There's really not too many cards from the new set that you can really include, but we don't think there's really much need to. It's good at what it does. It's really consistent in terms of trying to just create these big Duraludons. The Hyper Potions are obviously going to help out against everything that's trying to chip away slowly. Obviously, inherently, the deck has worries here and there because it's a bit inconsistent, but I think Stefan really perfected this list for this weekend, for the last weekend, and I don't think there's many changes that need to be made, to be honest. This more aggressive Trekking Shoes Tower of Darkness build is really a really great way of trying to alleviate some of the consistency issues that the deck has had in the past, and things like Avery and Karen's Conviction definitely still have a lot of value against one prize decks and VMAX decks respectively. So a really cool deck to try out if you're not wanting to invest in some of the new cards. Looking at some potential includes, Crystal Cave is obviously another one to help sort of buff Duraludon's HP. Like I say, there's lots of chip damage and sprinkle damage here and there that Duraludon can just laugh at if it's playing Crystal Caves, because it's basically just wasting these turns, which is fantastic. Again, same with Tool Jammer. Tool Jammer just trying to make your Duraludons a little bulkier here and there. Lots of choice belts and stuff around, as well as just disabling things like Big Charms and stuff that will creep in here and there. And then just more sort of consistency, Evo Incense, getting you into that first Arceus to help smooth over the first few turns until you're able to generate 2 massive skyscrapers and basically try and lock down the game from there. So yeah, nothing too sort of crazy, just a very standard Arc Duraludon list, let's be honest, but still one that we massively respect, and to be honest, could prove a bit of a hurdle for people just trying out the new stuff and kind of thinking that or forgetting or not really respecting some of the old decks that have been doing well recently.
On to number 6, and that is how far we believe Arceus has slipped in our ratings. The community are kind of in line with this one as well. You can never disrespect Arceus too much. We know that Trinity Nova accelerates all sorts of things and is so versatile, and Starbirth is still a way to get you into every game, essentially, by having a power spike on turn 2, where you can get a lot of combinations going. So really it's down to figuring out the best ways to partner up with Arceus. We don't necessarily have as clear of a path anymore, because Flying Pikachu still has that good type coverage, but it's less useful when there's a Kyurem in your face, and also less useful when there's a Giratina that has no weakness to boast. So it's a little bit more murky for Arceus to come up with easy partners. The one thing I will say is Sharon's Care seems to be really good into these one prize decks that have really come out in force, not only on the ladder, but also, as we saw, like the Japanese top 16 had a ton of them littering in there. I think it was 5 or 6 of them as these one prize builds. So having the Sharon's Care to wipe cram damage and get rid of Sableye damage is obviously really big. And I think Sharon's Care is going to be a big way that Arceus stays in the game as being one of these one prize punishers out there, which I think is really going to be strong. We have a few different Arceus builds to talk about here. So the first shell we're going to look at is a Arceus Giratina, where you just have high base damage output at your disposal with that lost impacts option. You have Shred inbuilt from the V as well, so you don't have to worry about having wacky backup attackers. And we are playing double Belt and Zig, so we can be aggressive with our Arceus V-Star on 220 hit point Vs, like Giratina's, like Palkia's and Kiram's as well. So that's really good. I've snuck in a Radiant Gardevoir as well to try and give us that little bit more bulk. Obviously, Mew most of the time has to bounce your path to the peak, so the Radiant Gardevoir is online, which I think is big, but also it means we stay out of range of opposing lost impacts. So we're hoping that our Tina can knock out theirs and they can't knock out ours. That's the deal. So that would be a good way to have a win condition against Giratina, especially because you have Sharon's Care to basically nullify a lot of their early cram hits as well. So I think that's still very strong. Still have the core of Path and Mani, which isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and you still have Big Barrel as this fallback. I think you'll see a pattern with most of the Arceus builds that I'm about to show. They're all going to be playing a couple copies of Sharon's Care, and that's mostly because I want to defend myself against these cram toolboxes. So let's move on to the next one, where we have Arceus VMAX. I have shoehorned in Sharon's, and it previously didn't play any Sharon's Care, so I have had to cut a few corners here to fit it all in. But Aggron, similarly to Tina, just has high raw base output. You have the 270 from the VMAX and the Merciless Strike from the regular V. If you've just Zig pinged anything, you can just blow them up. So you just have this raw base output at your disposal, and you're hoping that that's enough for the general field, and not having to worry about hitting for weaknesses here is kind of the idea that we're going for. And then the final 60 is one of the wackiest yet. I'll be the first to admit that, but this is my latest concoction to have some of the most important weaknesses covered here, where we have Flying Pikachu, obviously giving you better leads in the deck as a free retreater, whilst having type coverage for Palkia and still being good into some of these one prize decks. I do know, of course, that Sableye spreads counters, so you're not covering completely against a lot of these one prize builds, and there's a lot of boss and rope. I know that Pikachu's worse into most of the one prizes than it used to be, but it still is something that makes them play differently. And now I'm having the Aegislash package. The Aegislash has wall breaking inbuilt, so already you're not just losing to Miltank and other annoying stuff like that. But the Aegislash boasts that type coverage, which is important now into the Kiram VMAX, which is a popular archetype. And I've also snuck in the Drapion V to be an alternative way at helping us tackle the Mew VMAX, because I think it's slightly better than having a Crobat VMAX in your list. Although Crobat ideally sort of like goes for its attack, hopes to stay on board, and then just like attacks again for game, whereas the Drapion is almost always getting answered straight back. I feel like that one swing, especially with the other, boss tactics we can have in the deck, are going to be like enough, especially because we can buy turns still with the Big Charm, the Path, the Double Turbo in the deck. I feel like we can still gain avenues to two-shot the other VMAX, or like get around the VMAX and attack other things, like deal with Meloetta and one of their Genesects even. So that's kind of the idea that I've got going here. I'll be the first to admit, I've already tried Arceus Pikachu Aegislash before with the barrel, actually, just on ladder, and I think it's like an okay deck. So this is actually pulled from something that I've tried before. I've got a huge variety of supporters going on here with the Palpad sneaking back into the list, so there's a lot that I'm trying here. The Big Charm is really a plaster job as well to try and have a slightly better Tina matchup, so that could also be a card coming out of the list. We've got to kind of wait and see, but I'm trying to do a lot here, and it just proves that Arceus is back to the drawing board. If you want to make this big barrel combination work, you're going to have to try some new type coverages potentially, or some new partners, but you still have Arceus at the core, you still have good tempo, and there's still a lot to like about the deck.
Next up, we're talking about Mew VMAX. Obviously, it's fifth. That's kind of the lowest Mew's been for a while. But bear in mind, I think a lot of the top five we're talking about here actually are all very, very strong decks. So I wouldn't fret too much if Mew is what you're looking at right now. Obviously, there are a couple of things that initially, just out of the gate, Mew has to worry about. Drapion being the biggest one, because Drapion can basically be splashed into anything. There's decks that it makes sense in, there's decks that it doesn't make sense in, but the ones that it does make sense in definitely can quite easily pop it in, and realistically, a lot of the time you only need, like Joe said, one stab with the Drapion to be able to navigate your way through the rest of the matchup. And Drapion kind of moves us back towards the old Meloetta build. Obviously, the double turbo build was kind of the post Worlds big revelation, and actually has seen some really impressive results. And the deck is really cool, to be honest. It opens up a lot of interesting inclusions into the deck, but it is inherently a lot less aggressive, and Drapion really does feast against that deck because you're not able to uptrade back very well at all. Basically, you're locked into using Muse, which means Drapion they just have to weave in one Drapion and then find a way of recovering it. And in the decks that are playing Drapion, they typically are playing lots of rods and stuff, so it's not that difficult. So yeah, it kind of switches up how Mew needs to be played. Path is like not anywhere near as strong. Now Arceus has taken a bit of a fall from grace. Obviously, there were lots of Arceus Path decks there, but realistically, not many of the Tina decks are going to be playing it. Not many of the one prize decks are going to be playing it. And I think realistically, this Lost Zone engine is going to be the most popular, or going to be very popular going into some of these next regionals. Palkia still plays one, the Intel version, but the Kieran version needs its own abilities, so there's a lot less there. So you're actually a lot less worried about Path. Obviously, it's still something to keep in mind, but you're able to at least breathe a bit of a sigh of relief when it comes to not being able to use your abilities anymore. Onto the list, and realistically, it's like it's pretty simple. It's going back to that Meloetta engine, trying to still have options to uptrade. Essentially, this list we've kept as simple as possible, just trying to make sure Mew is still out-tempoing, outpacing people as and where it can. Biggest inclusions are the 2 Lost City, which help out against things like Drapion so that they can't double dip on you, as well as some of the Reggie decks and some of these one prize decks. That's one really good way of trying to deal with some of these one prize decks, is essentially Lost Citying their attackers, as well as jumping in and healing off some of the damage. Things like Oricorio and stuff are going to be really helpful with your Mew VMAXs, just tanking, jumping in, and weaving in Lost Cities to get rid of them. So eventually they're just not able to do anything, and you're able to just then start coasting through, as well as having some one prize attackers of your own, which is really nice. We're still playing the 4 stadiums as well, which is really important, but you can look into things like Lost Vacuum and Pumpkaboo. I still think I prefer the 4 stadiums just because the stadiums are very useful, though Lost City typically isn't like, is only live in some matchups compared to Rose Tower, which you always want. So now you have 2 dead stadiums. Maybe you can look at trying to find some more insta play cards. I still kind of respect Pumpkaboo, but I think realistically, the stadiums are more important right now because they actually, when they are in the matchups you need them in, they are really important. The Silene, Avery, and Marnie are here just to represent that quad double turbo build. I think realistically, Joe and I are pretty set on the fact that the Fusion Strike build is just a bit better right now. You need the tempo, you need the one prize attacks, you need the options that build gives you, as opposed to the space that the double turbo build gives you. But obviously, I think if nothing else, it was evident in Baltimore how impressive that double turbo build can be. So again, in the same way that we haven't been able to write off Duraludon or anything. There are definitely some more interesting options you can add into that double turbo build, and Avery and Marnie are still going to be great cards when you have the aggression of a Mew VMAX. So if that's the build you like, then there's nothing too wrong with it. But I think personally for Joe and I, the Fusion Strike build gives you way more tempo in the current meta, which is what you need right now.
On to number 4, we have Palkia Kieran VMAX, which is proving to be much more versatile than I was initially expecting. I really like Double Empoleon in this build. I know I've talked about Double Empoleon a few times on the channel. It's not going to be a surprise for you to hear that, but I think 2 Empoleon gives you a good answer into what's probably the most popular one prize deck in these Lost Zone boxes, because you can shut down Comfey so effectively and shut down Cramorant, which is always their early game option. So you're pretty covered into the most popular one prize matchup. The other one we've already discussed is going to be Reggie's, and even if they do play paths and ropes and stuff, I still think you can buy a lot of time in that matchup, which is very valuable just to get ahead in the game. And I think against multi-prizes, you're obviously covered as well. Palkia, as we know, can reach those higher thresholds, and so can that Kieran VMAX very easily with the big Max Frost if you can lean into it with a few gurus, or the initial one, of course, gets the big burst of Palkia, the V-Star effect as well, to get a huge burst of damage onto the field. So I really like this as an efficient racing deck. I think my biggest concern is that you don't have a huge engine to fall back on. You have early game consistency from Greninja, and you do have Guru, but you don't really have anything when you are getting hit with that Marnie and that Roxanne over and over again, when we are, at the end of the day, trying to get a few Stage 1 set up. But at its core, it seems pretty simplistic. It has so much going for it in terms of Greninja, Bucket, Irida, Palkia. These are just taking the best cards in the game previously and using them to their fullest effect with the Kirin VMAX. We've seen some Rotom phones sneaking into the deck. I would love to fit even more because I do think it's a strong card. So if there's any card that you sort of disagree with, getting more phones in is always good. I also think getting a good old Zigzagoon in here is valuable as well to hit that 280 with a searchable ball card rather than needing to hit Choice Belt with your Kirim, so sometimes you can save yourself an energy. These are definitely cards that I'm thinking of in the deck list. It can make that Palkia more versatile as well, but this is really close to a lot of the most successful 60s right now, and I'm pretty much on board with all the decisions here. Seems very good to me. For some potential other includes, Wash Water can be a way to protect yourself against some annoying effects of attacks. So that can be a way to protect yourself against Sableye Sprinkle. It can be a way to protect yourself around Giratina, of course, mostly for your Kirim here. Drapion could easily come to the list. I think with one Drapion, you have an extremely favoured Mew, actually, because your opponent literally has to deal with Drapion. They can't ignore the card. It's too dangerous for the Mew player. And if you have a Kirim in the back that you're just Glaciated World and turn attaching to, you've basically already got your next attacker ready to take the next 3-prize knockout. So especially if it's a quad DTE build of Mew, I think one Drapion immediately wins you that matchup as long as you draw okay. And I think it's really not easy for them to play around. If it's a Meloetta build, it becomes more of a conversation, but they have to get through Drapion and a big Kirim all in one turn, and it can still be a hassle for them. And then finally, Marnie versus Roxanne is a bit of a debate, because the deck is lacking that little bit of draw. I am quite light on supporters, so seeing a Marnie early is obviously way better than seeing a Roxanne early, and obviously we have a little bit less control of when that Roxanne actually finds its way into our hand. We basically need to continually draw through the deck with Melanie and Gurus and such, so if you see the Roxanne early enough, you can keep banking it with an Oranguru if you really want to. But Marnie's more of like a fluid card that you can see at any point throughout the game, and it's still that little bit of help for you. So I'm still debating whether the Marnie or Roxanne is stronger right now, just based on how this deck naturally cycles through its own 60.
Next up, we have Lost Box, and I think even though this is rated 3rd and the community rating 5th, I actually think this is probably the most popular deck on ladder right now. There's been so much of it, and there's been so many different variants. It's probably because it's technically like, well, we're going to look at like 3 different builds, so it all lumped together. That's probably why, but yeah, it's a very, very aggressive deck, and I think even though a lot of people really rated this deck, it's actually outshone a lot of people's initial ratings, which is really cool to see. I think more than anything, it's that Sableye that's been doing fantastically well. The Lost Zone engine looks to be very, very versatile. It looks to have lots of different options. Looks to be really aggressive, like I say, and have some great damage output. And yeah, Sableye provides some really, really nice sort of flexibility and damage in the late game for dealing with other Lost Zone engines, with things like Sobble and Teleon engines. It's just a really, really good all-round package, which is just great. There's going to be 3 lists we're taking a look at today, because there's kind of lots of, well, there's not just 3, there's loads of different ways you can play it. The first is the Radiant Charizard build. This, I think, is probably the one of the easiest ones to play, because you're not all in, but you have a fantastic array of sort of 1-prize options, as well as options for dealing with 2 prizes. And I think this is likely the most popular one as well. As you can see, we've got Cramorant, Sableye, and Charizard as the different sort of avenues of attack for those different options, which is really cool. There was a fantastic list that did well in Japan that played a crazy 3 Echoing Horn. We think that's a little bit too crazy, and we've dropped it down to the 1. But it's still a really, really nice inclusion, because you can pick up a 2-prizer with it and close the game quickly. You can pick up an additional 1-prizer like a Sobble or a Comfey or something like that, and have an extra target for Sableye. It's just a really, really nice card. In general, there's lots of sort of different ways that you can help mitigate some of the early discards and early lost zones as well. We've got things like Palpad. You've got all of the different sort of recovery options from Clara and all of this kind of stuff. So it feels like this is the one that has the most sort of defense in terms of awkward choruses and awkward conveys, because there's at the sort of the heart of the deck, there's still this Charizard that can just trade up into a lot of 2 prizes, which is great and can be an issue of some of the other 1 prize archetypes. Moving on to the second build, we have a Radiant Greninja build, which is personally my favorite. Mirage Gate being able to power up Radiant Greninja is really, really cool. You've also got Snorlax as well. That's kind of your inclusion instead of Radiant Zard for some damage that's a little bit more than just this 1 prize damage from Cram, which is really nice. You've got lots of ways to be able to sort of recover these energy after you've been able to discard them with concealed cards and pull off sort of Greninja turns, sometimes even back to back, which is really, really cool to see. Being able to go for Moonlight Shuriken 2 turns in a row is pretty crazy, but it's actually possible with builds like this, which is really nice. The Irida is another nice inclusion as well, because being able to pick up Greninja plus like Battle VIP Pass in the early turns or some switch outs to really push towards the first Mirage Gates, even being able to find like Greninja Mirage Gate or whatever, is just really, really strong if you haven't been able to find it in the early turns. So yeah, the one of Irida is a nice little inclusion. You'll notice Roxanne in some of these lists as well. Again, Joe mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of these sort of 1 prize lists end up building a massive hand. So being able to try and do something cool like Sableye away their 2 Confays in combination with a Roxanne or something can be honestly a game-winning play, even if you're still taking a few turns away from being able to win the game, still have 2 prizes after that or whatever. It's a really, really strong play just because it slows them down enough that you then can Moonlight Shuriken or Sableye again or whatever. So it's a nice inclusion for sure. And then finally, we have sort of a more box style build. There's been this 2 prize build that's been going around. Drapion has seen some play in some of these other lists just because it's a great card into Mew, but then this list also plays Raikou and Crabominable, as well as Luminion. I think this is personally my least favorite build because the 2 prizes can become a bit of a liability, especially given that you're playing 4, you can end up starting them in awkward spots, which is really annoying. But being able to have or cover your type weakness as well as have a big bomb from Crabominable and things like that, it's going to be really, really cool to see. Basically, just really leaning into that Mirage Gate and trying to make as much use out of that as possible. Like I say, I think the 2 prizes often end up being liabilities here and there, but as long as you use them in the right spots, they can often be trading up, which is kind of what you need because, or trading evenly, because which is kind of what you need because things like Sableye and Radiant Greninja then are sort of the cards that end up trading up and you win prize trades that way. So yeah, outside of starting the 2 prizes, they're okay, but starting them does kind of hurt the inherent 1 prize nature of the deck, where you're able to do more than your opponent across 6 prizes because you actually have such powerful 1 prize attackers. So yeah, there's loads of options for the Lost Zone deck. We're not going to have a potential includes because it would be a whole video of its own, to be honest. There's so many different things to try, and I really implore you to try out some different sort of options. I think that I've seen so many crazy things that have none of them have been like crazy good, but basically everything in a Lost Zone engine can work just because of how strong Mirage Gate is. So definitely have a look through your bulk and through your PCGO account and see if there's any surprise attackers you can need in there, because it genuinely could be the difference between a win or a loss. There's so many things, and people just won't have like analyzed every option yet. So make sure you have a play around with the Lost Zone box. It's also a really difficult deck to play, I think. There's a lot of decisions, but it's a really good one to understand because it also inherently, when we'll talk about Tina momentarily, you learn about a couple of decks in one and about what your opponent can do with them, which is really nice. But also some of the decisions you make, you can then you kind of you're forced into a lot of decisions, which some of them are pretty ugly, to be honest. And it's a really rewarding deck to play, I think. So yeah, definitely try this one out and try and make your own spicy 1 prize Lost Zone box deck.
In at number 2, we have the Lost Zone Giratina. We've already talked about it alongside Arceus, but we feel like the Lost Zone has proven itself at this point. Similar to what we were saying with the sort of Kiram, Palkia, and probably what we're going to be saying about Palkia and Teleon as well, is that all of these top decks are really good at playing the 1 prize game when they have to, then pivoting immediately when you need that higher damage output. And I think Thornton is a great enabler for that in general. And there could be other decks that take advantage of Thornton as well. Certainly for that idea where you have an entire board of 1 prizes, you limit your opponent to exactly 1 prize that turn, and then you go, boom, here's this big guy that's responding on their big guy. And Tina kind of does that the best because you're already leaning heavily into this Lost Zone and you have Mirage Gate to just burst a Tina out of nowhere. You have that 280 hit points with no weakness. You can immediately Requiem and just knock out anything, even if it's a 3-prizer. And then the Tina's sat on board saying, I have lost impact for game next turn. Basically, literally any energy wins me the game because nothing can really tank that 280 too easily either. So that's just an incredible thing to have in the deck, whilst also taking advantage of many of the cards we've just talked about in the 1-prize Lost Zone box. And you're basically almost playing that game plan with a few extra little treats in here as well, this little package of the Tina. I personally like having the double Rod in the list compared to Rod plus Recycler, because then it allows you to have this 1-prize game plan for like that much longer in like almost mirrors, where you have the double Cram, the 1 Sableye, and the Zig in here as well. So with double Rod, you can constantly try and recycle those Crams and those Sableyes pretty happily, and also get enough energy into your deck for when you need to burst Mirage Gate and even use Radiant Greninja or whatnot. We have the Fish in here to try and get us the Thornton play off, which I think is really strong. Thornton can obviously also be used in the 1-prize matchup to immediately get you back into a Sableye or get a Radiant Greninja that they weren't expecting onto the field, which I think can be also really cool. So a lot of versatility around the Thornton card, not just for bursting this Giratina onto the scene, but the Tina is just an excellent option, to be honest. It's a really strong card. It can come onto the board early if you feel like safe enough in lower damage output matchups like Goodra, or against some Arceus builds you can get a Tina and just sort of sit around and boast that you can't be knocked out and just take the 4 prizes on his own pretty happily. So this is kind of the big differential of this build compared to the 1-prize Lost Zone boxes. You just have that wall-breaking power, that raw damage output. That Requiem can be absurd into 3 prizes, of course, but you have that key differential that the Lost Zone box has to wait around for a Charizard forever or have random type coverages to try and spike at the right moment. The Tina just does the thing. It has those high numbers that you need when you need them, so it's just much more versatile as a deck. You might be slightly unfavored to the pure 1-prize builds because they just have more outs to the 1-prizers, but you can try and keep up in that game for the majority of the time, then burst this late game 2-prizer, which has a huge amount of hit points for them to get through. You still have that Roxanne play that can always be pretty heroic in these spots as well. You have that consistency from Greninja and the ton of flower selecting. It ticks so many boxes. It's a really versatile and strong deck, and like Jack was saying with some of the other Mirage Gate stuff, it really pays off to be aware of your resources, knowing how many energies can find their way into the Lost Zone, how many you need to Rod back in, how many you need to have access to Training Court the entire game from Radiant Greninja and whatnot. Even just attaching to a Comfey to almost fake being a means of retreating a Comfey at any point in the game, then turns into your Thornton target and stuff like that. There's so many intricate plays you can make with this deck. Even using Lumineon in 1-prize matchups to be a tank that then Aqua returns into the deck with Mirage Gate is also a play, and that's actually a really cute one that I've seen a few times now, and I think is so awesome, actually. So yeah, very cool deck with so many lines available to it. Really awesome one that gets better the more I play the deck. I forgot about some potential includes. There are a lot here. Drapion could obviously be helpful against Mew. Snorlax is another way to have this tanky 1-prize mon in here as well, to just remain that 1-prizer. Guru allows you to do some cool Mirage Gate combos, as well as protecting things like Colress or Roxanne to the top of your deck. I've already talked about why I like Rod over Recycler, but Recycler's also a popular card. The Leafeon's actually still kind of interesting. I feel like if the meta's heavily weighted towards Mew and Kyurem and other multi-prize matchups, the Leafeon still is really good for me. But if we continue to see 1-prizes be prevalent, the Leafeon doesn't make quite as much sense, because it's not like you're going, okay, cool, let's put a Crobat, a Leafeon, and 2 Tinas on the board. That's just not the board state you want if it's 1-prize heavy. So the Leafeon is meta dependent whether or not you want to have the card in the deck. And then there's the questions of Lost Vacuum that can help you get to Requiem and to all this other stuff a little bit quicker, whilst also being away around big charms and stuff like that, which is kind of nice. It can also be an extra stadium bounce if need be. And there's the question of Marnie versus Roxanne, where again it's just one of these cards that adds to your lower support account that you naturally play, that can just give you some cycle in the opening turns whilst also disrupting the opponent.
And on to number 1, we have Palkia and Teleon. Still probably the best deck of last format, and realistically a fantastic deck going forward. It's not to no one's surprise, really. Still got great sort of one-hit KO potential. Still got a lot of sort of inherent tutoring from the deck, so you're able to deal with things in the best way possible, and also inherently having some great options for one prize matchups, just because you have things like Inteleon that can trade into the one prize matchups, and it's really difficult for them to trade back, which is nice. I still think there's a lot of great options. Water still has the best support. Realistically, it was like Joe was saying, where you're just putting all of the great cards into a deck. Palkia has so much support right now, just inherently from being a water type, which is really nice. The list is pretty simple. It's got a couple of sort of includes that were maybe flexible before that I now we feel really important. Things like Echoing Horn, Cancelling Cologne, and Rare Candy as one-offs. All of these cards have kind of been in and out, but all of them I think have real value right now. Cancelling Cologne helping out against other Manaphy's, Echoing Horn just for that additional damage, and Candy to really be able to push into the early shady dealings, and then Aqua Bullet if you need to against these one prize matchups. The list we're presenting actually has squeezed in the Rare Candy as well as a heavier Battle VIP pass count, which is something that typically decks did one or the other. It's because Joe and I are both really aware that the wider this board goes, realistically, the better the options are for the deck. Even in a world with all of this Sableye stuff, it's still really important to establish a good board and then maybe start netting things up later on, so Sableye can't be quite as disruptive against you. Still really important to go wide, but also having that backdoor option of being able to go into Rare Candy Inteleon and start attacking, not just against the one prize matchups, but particularly against the one prize matchups, because they struggle to deal with an Inteleon for the first couple of turns. Basically, their only answers are things like Snorlax and stuff, which obviously require a bit more setup than normal. So it can sometimes, tank a hit from a Cram and then start setting up a couple of prizes with things like Inteleon pings or Radiant Greninja here and there, which is really nice. Inherently, the list still plays lots of one-offs. We're still playing things like the Roxanne and the Marnie. There's still the Raihan in here to help out again with the Inteleon and stuff. So it's trying to do a lot. It's trying to squeeze in a lot of one-offs. But if there's a deck that can do it realistically, it's going to be a deck that can tutor out all of these pieces as and when it needs. So a fairly standard list, but a couple of cards that we really think are staple right now in things like Cancelling Cologne. Tech-wise, there are some other potential includes, Big Charms and Tool Jammers to try and be less aggressive and more tanky. These kind of, particularly the Big Charm, is really good if you're really expecting a lot of one prize matchups where things like the choice button stuff aren't going to be quite as popular. Zigzagoon is another one that's really good for the one prize matchups, as well as just helping out damage here and there. Being a plus 30 instead of a plus 20 is actually hugely relevant, especially when dealing with Palkia maths against two prizes. And Ordinary Rod and Palpad just for additional recovery. Obviously, there are some very important, particularly supporters that the deck plays only in a one count. So Palpad can be really important for just making sure you guarantee or you're able to use those twice, things like the Raihan and the Melanie, or even the boss and stuff like that. Still a really, really flexible deck. I feel like I haven't talked particularly about anything crazy about the deck, but it's just because it was one of the best decks of the last format, and it still is. Still does exactly what it needs to do, and actually represents Oko potential, which is really important in a meta that can. So it actually can keep up with things like Tina and stuff, because typically these Lost Zone engines have to go quite wide. So whilst being able to represent Oko on Tina, things like the Big Charm and Tool Jammer can help out in surviving Tina, as well as having additional one prize options for their one prize options. It still basically has the whole package, which is really nice. There's also, I feel like, a few less random lightning counters out there than there have been in the past as well. So whilst there's things like Reggie's and the Flying Pikachu and all of that kind of stuff, a lot of these one prize decks, there's only like really one or two variants that play things like Raikou or Zoroark or anything. So the weakness is still a worry, but I think we're actually at the point in the format right now where people aren't really like massively teching lightning weakness, to be honest. So that definitely could change over the next couple of weeks. We still have over a week until Peoria, so that's not to say people won't be finding space for this, especially if people start to catch on that this could still be a very, very popular archetype. But right now it feels like Palkia still can be pretty tanky in a lot of these matchups, which is really, really good.
So that wraps up our top 10. We have a few that are kind of just peeking in right now, or ones that are piquing our interest, even if they haven't yet proven themselves. I'm going to start with a couple down at the bottom here. We have The Galarian Wheezing with Radiant Sneasler actually augmenting that poison damage that little bit. Just really speeding up the win condition of this Wheezing, but neutralizing gas similar to the Empoleon. Very, very annoying, having naturally probably some other dark type attacking Pokemon in here, the likes of Crobat VMAX as a backup, possibly even Hisuian Samurott as a backup V-Star option in your deck. Seems like a reasonable option, so you can have a good time into Mew. You can hope that Wheezing is disruptive enough against the likes of Palkia and Teleon, as well as all these Comfey engines, that you just sort of win the game in like 5 turns because the opponent's not been able to get set up. It's obviously a risky strategy. It's not nailed on, especially if the opponent has a workable enough hand that they get into the game, then you really don't have much power on your side. But I have seen a lot of early concessions to Weezings on ladder, and they actually are doing like pretty well into the Comfey engine. So that's one that I'm thinking about for sure. Then we have the Hisuian Arcanine. Certainly a cool deck, and certainly one that does have some merits. I do like that it has a Slowbro option in some one-prize matchups, although I still feel, thanks to Sableye control over your board, you're going to have a bad time there. I do think it's nice into like at least a Reggie matchup to be able to yoink that extra prize when you need to. I don't think there's a reason for Dunsparce to particularly be into Arceus decks, because I think the format is too wide for Arceus to care also about fighting type stuff. So I feel like Arcanine can at least boast a good type coverage in that instance. And you can play a couple other toolboxy Pokemon if you want to with the Zoro. I haven't actually done a video of this yet on the channel, but we know that it can use the likes of Altaria, the likes of Oranguru, also, of course, Radiant Venusaur to top up the hand when you feel like you have to, or haven't been able to bank something on the top of your deck. So, very cool deck, throwback to that Gramble. I don't think it necessarily has a lot of reasons to play the deck, but it's at least a fun one if it's your pet choice. And then Vikavolt with Zapdos is low-key getting a little bit scary, actually, I think, because it's really good at stopping this Lost Zone box deck. You, of course, hit for weakness into the Cramorant, so one Zapdos lets you knock out Crams. You're denying Rod as well, which is a massive way that they actually have enough attackers in most situations, so having early answers to Crams is good. You can stop Comfeys from dancing around the board and then filling up their Lost Zone. You obviously shut down Mirage Gate as well, so things like Giratina actually becomes a slow attacking threat that you can get a lot of free turns against, and Vikavolt does hit for at least a key weakness against Palkia, so augmenting that damage with more Zapdos and whatnot could be really, really helpful, actually, in a low-key way. I think you can play some Drapions to have a decent time against Mew, but then it's just that massive other question mark of like, how do I beat Arceus decks and stuff? And not really having a game plan against Arceus has been one of the main reasons why Vikavolt has seen no play up until now. But there are at least some matchups that you're targeting with Vikavolt. I'm kind of more of the idea that a Vikavolt deck has to be like a toolbox, and you just play Vikavolt plus some other stuff. But there are big merits to having item lock in the game right now, and this type coverage ain't too shabby either.
Yeah, and onto some 2-prize archetypes, or multi-prize archetypes. The first is Thornton Urshifu. Now, admittedly, this is a deck that I think Joe and I are still very much trying to work out how to make work, but the concept behind it is just insane. Being able to use you're being able to use kind of any engine and then Thornton into an Urshifu sounds really, really strong, but having things like the Lost Zone engine, maybe Sableye setting up damage for you to be able to Thornton into an Urshifu, and Gmax Rapid Flow sounds really good. Being able to use some of these other Rapid Strike Pokemon and then Thornton into an Urshifu sounds really good. There's a lot of Manaphy right now, but it feels like in a one-prize deck, if you're playing like a one-prize deck with just this Thornton Urshifu package in the late game, you can deal with the Manaphy, whether it's via Sneasler, whether it's via just bossing it up and KOing it with a Cramorant or something, or depending on what archetype you're playing that you're putting this package into. This isn't necessarily a deck, it's more just the concept of Thornton Urshifu seems really, really strong. We haven't worked out exactly how yet. I'm sure someone, probably with the surname Reklev, is trying to right now. But realistically, it seems very, very powerful, especially with all of these one prizes going around. So yeah, and still being a really tanky 3-prizer, I think seems very, very beneficial. So that's a really cool one. Origin Form Dialga, with the Lost Zone engine, is actually something that started to see play on ladder over the past couple of days, and actually it has really impressed me, to be honest. Dialga already sort of hiccuped here and there when it was all in trying to Star Chronos as quickly as possible and just push people out of the game. But now you have this Lost Zone engine, you can kind of play a one prize game, play a tempo game, take prizes with Cramorants here and there, just have an attachment that you're able to, again, maybe Thornton into and try and go that way, or maybe just start to build that crazy big hand that we've mentioned with the Lost Zone package, and then just being able to put a Dialga down and basically saying, deal with this Dialga this turn in combination with, trying to deal with the one price pressure that I'm applying. And if you can't, I'm going to Star Cronus you, and then I'm going to Meta Blast you, and I'm going to take 2 turns, and I'm going to win the game. So, yeah, a really, really interesting one that I think is yet to be fully explored. It's only just kind of popped up because there's honestly so many options with the Lost Zone engine. It's taken this long for people to sort of get to this one on their list, but it seems like a really impressive one, to be honest. And finally, Arceus in Teleon. Now, it's a pretty wild one to have outside the top 10, just because I think inherently a lot of people will pick this deck up. But it's, like Joe said when talking about Arceus in general, it feels like this Arceus really has to go back to the drawing board and adapt right now. And I think the Inteleon build doesn't have as much space for other attacking options that the Arceus decks need to have compared to the Barrel engine. So because of that, we've dropped it just outside the top 10. I still think it still has the best shooter in the game, like undeniably. I still think it's one of the tankiest. You're able to build a list that is one of the tankiest in the game. Being able to loop Sharon's Care, which we've already said is a very appealing thing in a format with lots of chip damage and sprinkle damage for 1 prizes. But things like Giratina existing are really scary. Things like just being able to deal 280 means that you are really forced to make sure you have either some amount of damage nullifiers or stuff like that, which is annoying because it's just not like the list's already struggled with sort of Palkias sometimes just dealing like 250 a turn because you'd have to keep chaining things like that. So Giratina's existence does worry me a bit. But having the best shooter in the game, and realistically, again, in the same way that Palkia can present these one prize options, being able to play a deck with Inteleon that maybe you build it, you cater it so that you're actually able to attack with Inteleon a bit more frequently than in previous builds to try and deal with some of these one prize engines and trying to figure out how to deal with the elephant in the room that is Giratina. Maybe Arceus V-Star with Inteleon can still prove a worthy inclusion into the format. We just feel like the flexibility of the barrel build, being able to pair it with another attacker, typically is going to be a bit better in a wider meta where Arceus feels like it was just really good at playing around the sort of the soft damage cap of the format that's basically been wiped out since Giratina's been printed. So yeah, there's some multi-prize decks that you can try out if you're wanting to play outside the top 10.
So that just about wraps up this top 10. I'm sure a lot will be changing over the next few weeks. As we know, people will knee-jerk based on Peoria's results as we move into the next tournament and then again. So I feel like we have so wide of a format, especially with Mirage Gate, that we can make basically anything work right now, which is insane. But Jack, what's your favourite deck to have been playing so far in this format, and what deck would you say, going in blind now to Peoria, you would be targeting right now?
I think my favorite deck is I've just been enjoying trying the Lost Zone engines out. Yeah. I still feel like I'm very rusty with a lot of them, but I think that's going to be the case for a while because there are a lot of decisions, a lot of really important decisions in those decks that even more than some decks in the past, that one rough sort of flower selecting early on can really butterfly affect its way throughout the game. You're like, oh, I needed that. So they're really difficult, but they're really rewarding decks to play. I think my favorite so far has been Thorntontina. Just because knowing in the back of your mind you have that inevitability is really, really powerful. Especially when, like you mentioned, having an attachment on a Comfey is one relatively inconspicuous anyway, but 2 is just good to have because it's just being able to move around a bit more. So it's not like you're doing anything bad to play into the Thornton. So yeah, I think that's my favorite. I think the biggest thing to target, I think realistically Palkia will still be probably the most popular individual deck, but I think making sure your deck has an answer to one prize decks. I think even though we've rated it third, I think the one prize builds, like the purely one prize builds, maybe combined will even be more popular than Palkia, to be honest. So I think that's going to be the main focus. I think if I were playing in Peoria, it would be trying to work out, can my deck deal with one prize decks and working from there, probably.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I feel like the one prize Greninja with Gates has been my favourite deck to be toying around with right now. There's so much resource management to be keeping track of the deck, the discard pile, the zone, the prize cards. It's a real great puzzle that, again, like you said, does feel really rewarding. And I think if I was sleeving up anything for Peoria right now, it would probably be the Kiram Palkia. I've been preaching double Empoleon so long, and it's my favorite Pokemon, so I get to play Empoleon and Gurus. I just can't say no to that sort of thing, especially when it's actually a playable archetype. So that's going to be it for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and we'll be back with another one tomorrow. Cheers.